Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the basics of heart failure. So let's talk about heart failure. Now heart failure is commonly referred to as CHF. And the C stands for congestive heart failure. Now when thinking about the heart, I think it's important to understand the basic anatomy and the basic flow of the blood through the heart, which makes it very easy to understand heart failure. So in the chest, you have the heart, and if we kind of pull that picture over to here, we're now looking at the heart, and you're looking straight at it. And it's divided into atria and ventricles. Atria are on top, and ventricles are on the bottom. And the atria are labeled the left atrium, and then you have the left ventricle. On the right side of the heart, the same applies. You have your right atrium and your right ventricle. Blood gets pumped from the atria to the ventricles, and then the ventricles out to their respective, either to the body or to the lungs. So the general flow of blood, say let's start with oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs. It goes into the left atrium, then goes down into the left ventricle, and then it is pumped by the pumping action of the heart out into the aorta, and it goes to the rest of the body. It goes to the brain, it goes to the arms, it goes to the liver, it goes to the organs in the abdomen. And then all of those organs and extremities use up the oxygen. They send deoxygenated blood back through the inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium. From the right atrium, then it goes to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle pumps blood out, we'll say, into the lungs. And that's how the blood gets oxygenated back into the left atrium, and the whole process starts over again. So that's the flow of blood, and when you have heart failure, think of it as just a traffic jam of that process. So you have a backflow of fluid, backflow of blood into chambers that are supposed to normally be contracting and pumping blood away. It's backing fluid back up. So that's the basics of heart failure. So over here I have drawn just the left ventricle. So when we talk about our types of heart failure, we want to think about this as just the left ventricle over here. It's this right here. And as I mentioned, blood comes down in from the atria to the ventricle and then out into the aorta. And that's where blood flows out into the rest of the body, everything below the heart, up into the structures in the head and neck and upper arm. So that's the left ventricle. And what I've drawn over here in the shaded region here is the muscle of the heart. And that's what does the contracting or the heavy lifting during the pumping action of the heart. When we think about heart failure, I want us to think about the two main functions of the heart. And really, the heart only has two functions. It's a very important organ, but it only has two functions. The first function is to pump blood. And this is referred to as systole. The second function of the heart is to relax and fill with blood. And this is referred to as diastole. When we think about heart failure, we have to determine whether it is systolic or diastolic heart failure. Sometimes it's a combination of both because they change the anatomy, they change the symptoms, they change how the heart looks on imaging. So let's talk about that imaging. If you have someone who's suspected of having heart failure, they go to the cardiologist, and the cardiologist does what is called an echocardiogram. And on the echocardiogram, they physically look at the heart on ultrasound and determine how good of a squeeze it has or how good of a pump it has. And we define that as something called an ejection fraction. And this is essentially just the percentage of blood that is pumped with each squeeze of the heart. And I think it's important to know that ejection fraction normal is greater than 50% normal. So the first type of heart failure that we have is called systolic heart failure. In systolic heart failure, you have a reduced ability to pump. So if we think about that, that's going to reduce our ejection fraction. So with systolic heart failure, we have a less than 50% ejection fraction. And this leads to the heart being filled with more blood than it's used to, or than is normal, and that leads to a dilated heart. So the first type of heart failure is systolic heart failure, in which the heart's pumping function is not functioning appropriately. And that leads us to systolic heart failure. The other type of heart failure is called diastolic heart failure. And diastolic heart failure is often referred to as heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, because the heart's pump is still doing its job, but it's having a hard time relaxing and filling. So I've drawn that same left ventricle down here. And what happens in diastolic heart failure with the preserved ejection fraction, is this muscle becomes very stiff, and the heart no longer has its elasticity to fill with blood. Less blood is fitting in here, which means less blood is pumped out into the aorta, and once again we have that same traffic jam type problem. And with diastolic heart failure, our ejection fraction, as I mentioned, is normal. Diastolic heart failure. In diastolic heart failure, we don't have too much blood in the chamber. We have not enough because we can't fill it as much. It's a very stiff chamber. That leads to a less dilated heart on echocardiogram. And that's really it. Those are the two types of heart failure that you can have. And the two function, either one of them fail or both, you tend to get heart failure. Now, the last thing I think we need to talk about is what causes heart failure. And if we think about the causes, let's take a new chart down here. Causes. And causes are kind of in the same category as the risk factors for heart failure. When we think about the causes and the risk factors of heart failure, we can really divide it into two categories. The first one is called ischemic, and ischemic just means a lack of oxygen. So things that cause a lack of oxygen to the heart. And the two main ones are coronary artery disease, which is heart disease, and coronary artery disease leads to myocardial infarctions or heart attacks. Now, the other category of causes or risk factors we can lump into the non-ischemic. And the non-ischemic causes are really just diseases or pathology that lead you to be more likely to develop some of these other ischemic causes. And the ones I'm talking about are high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, DM stands for diabetes mellitus. There are toxins, things that are directly harmful to the heart, and things I'm thinking of here are things like alcohol and things like cocaine. There are certain chemotherapy drugs that directly hurt or hinder the heart. There are some people who are unfortunately just born with bad hearts, and they have hereditary causes. And then less commonly in the developing world, you have more infectious causes. So things like viral myocarditis and those kind of things that typically cause a viral reason to have heart failure are infectious. And they tend to cluster more, as I mentioned, in the third world. And I think it's important right here to think that these top three on this chart are actually three of the leading causes of what actually cause coronary artery disease and myocardial infarctions. But these are generally the causes and the risk factors that lead one to have heart failure. So there you have it. You have the basics of the heart, the basics of the heart function, how the blood flows. And if you think about heart failure as just a backflow of fluid, in the next video we will talk more about the signs and symptoms of heart failure, and it'll make more sense because really it's just a backflow of this fluid and your heart's not doing what it's supposed to be doing.